And the clicker works. It's going to be incredible. I'm so happy. All right, let me get all the extra fluff out of the way. I want to see my bookmarks, I'm sure, or my apps, or any of the other things I'm going to try and click now. And boom, we're in. All right, here goes, everyone. I'm going to race through this. So is everybody dialed in? We need to be locked in. It's going to be great. Part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this in kind of 3 stages. The first time, I'm just going to basically tell you why I'm short token voting. Then the second thing I'm going to do is tell you why I'm long prediction markets. And then the last thing I'm going to do is present kind of an alternative vision for governance. How's that sound? Right? Remember the three, huh? You can't hear me? Okay. All right. I'm going to project a lot. Okay? All right, let's go. So Futarchy, your next Treasury Manager is a prediction market. It's a bold claim. So we're going to start out with a proposal that you may or may not be familiar with, depending on how involved in DAOs you are. Tally is one of the sponsors of this event. They're a huge governance, I guess, protocol now, but before like application, they kind of sit on top of the governor contract. So you can imagine the governor contract as a system for making decisions, and they sit on top. They provide a nice interface application that kind of extends the functionality to things that you and I would like to use, like a nice clean application, a website we can go to, like buttons we can click and so on. And they've built this incredible platform. They've been building it for a while. And they recently put in this proposal to ask the DAO if it would fund them. So the question is, there's a DAO or a protocol with some resources, and they're asking for some of those resources. And we have this system of decision-making called voting. And the voting system has already been set up, and it's a way of gathering information from Uniswap token holders. So question, should Uniswap DAO distribute $250,000 a year to Tally for its services? Fairly simple question. I think everybody in this room, even if you're not directly involved in Uniswap, might have an opinion on this. Do you have an opinion? Raise your hand. Okay, cool. Great, people have opinions. So, as you can see, this passed. Very happy for Tally. I think they're actually awesome and very necessary. And I'm glad this passed. The question you have to ask yourself is, why did it pass? When people decided to vote with their tokens, why did they pick 4? Now, I don't know about you, but myself, for me, I'm dangerously long me, right? I hold a full bag of me tokens, right? Just like everybody else. And what I'm trying to communicate here is we're all dangerously long ourselves. We're all very self-interested. We only really care about the things that affect us in a positive way or a negative way, right? And you can't escape those. Now, if you think about a token vote, a good way of thinking about a token vote is that it's just a token-weighted average of everyone's interests, everyone's own interests. So you ask every single person, based on how many tokens they hold, what they think, and they're just going to think, well, for or against, is this good or bad for me, right? And this is not entirely true, right? Because people have loads of different reasons for voting. But this is basically the only thing you can guarantee when you ask people to vote. They're going to make decisions that are in their interests. Everyone following me so far? All right, so again, this is kind of leading up to why I'm short token voting. Now I'm going to change gears a little bit. We actually ran an event called GG in Edge City a couple of weeks ago. And each day, we called it governance games. And each day, we ran a different mechanism, a different way of making decisions. And on the first day, we ran this. So we ran the first column, which was, we asked people to come up with governance problems, and then we asked them to vote on them. We gave everybody 2 stickers, and we said, put the sticker on the thing you think is most valuable to solve. And we produced that. There were other questions, but these are kind of like aggregated. So voter apathy, 5 votes. Delegate incentive, 6 votes. Lots of the people in the audience were delegates. User acquisition, 3 votes. Accountability, 6. And KPI-based resource allocation, 2. Now, the next day, we ran the auctions day. So this is where we were auctioning off proposals. It's a weird mechanism, and I won't go through it, but imagine that instead of voting on proposals, you had to bid on them, right? We're going to have an auction running. And when you get the proposal, you get to execute it. And so the bid technically should reflect the valuation that you have for the success of the protocol, right? Or sorry, for the success of the proposal. And this time around, I said, imagine when you win this bid and you get the proposal, you get to keep all of the return that's created for the DAO, for the protocol, right? So you bid, and if it's like voter apathy improves the DAO by some margin, and then you get to keep that. And it produced that distribution of bids on the right. So interesting parts, voter apathy, people thought like voting-wise, 5, this is really important, right? One of the highest, 1 bid. People don't think that's valuable. Another one is accountability, 6, 9. The best one, I mean, delegate incentive, 6, 6. Again, we had delegates in the room. And then KPI-based resource allocation, 2. bid 7. So what I'm showing you is even though you may have the same people, when people have their incentives slightly changed, they're going to give you different information, right? So voters have an unknown stake in the outcome of a proposal. You don't know what their self-interests are. You don't know what bags they hold. You don't know. Bidders can be given an explicit stake in an outcome that we choose, right? This is one of the core insights of how prediction markets can be used for decision making. And finally, we can give bidders skin in the game in games that give us the information we need to make a decision. When we want to decide whether to give money from a treasury to some project, any investment, what do we actually care about? What's the thing we're trying to target? Is it like growth of the token? Is it like growth of the number of people who actually use the protocol? And we can actually craft these really specific games or markets to try and like pull that information from the actual participants and then make a decision. And this is why we think that we can use prediction markets for decision making. So now we're going to talk about markets as a general mechanism for information aggregation. Anybody who's been following the US election, which I assume is pretty much every single person in the room, knows that we recently elected a candidate and that there was a prediction market running the whole time. And the question is whether prediction market's more accurate than the polls. Polls are also kind of could be seen as like a vote, right? So let's say that I take $1 and I put it in a contract and I say that in the future we're going to end up in one of two worlds. They're going to end up in a world where we've elected one president or one candidate, and we're going to end up in another world where we've elected the other, right? This is a way of thinking about like the probabilistic representation like from prediction markets. And then I say that anybody who holds the A token, the candidate A token, or candidate A contract will get to like redeem that $1. And I can sell as many of these as I want. And this is all that prediction markets are. And the way you have to think about this is if someone's looking at these two options, so they're looking at the first one, they're going to be in this world, the only thing they have to ask themselves is, if I buy this contract, what's the chance I end up in this world? Because that's going to be the expected value I have for that $1. If I think there's a 50% chance that we could end up in that world, I'm only willing to buy that contract if it's less than 50 cents. Does that make sense? Right? Because you can you're only going to make $1 if you end up in that world. You only believe that's going to happen 50% of the time. So that $1 is worth 50 cents to you. Like if you understand that, and that makes perfect sense to you, you understand pretty much everything about how prediction markets work. And you can take this and you can dial it up into conditional markets. Like what's the probability that you end up in this world if conditional on something else happening? And if you take that again, you can take the same probability and figure out how to make decisions, right? So let's go through that process. So again, this is the other world you could end up in. And so, as I said, you might ascribe like 50 cents to each of these. And if, let's say, you believe that candidate B has an edge, like you're the French whale, you're like that candidate has an edge, you're willing to bid up to the probability you expect we will end up in that world. So again, if I buy that 50-cent token or 50-cent contract, it's going to push the price up and push down the price of the other one, right? So, sorry for the slow loading. But yeah, so then that would mean that you're at 51, and then obviously if the candidate wins, everybody who holds that contract is going to get $1, and everybody who holds the other contract is going to get 0. Make sense? Because there's only $1. It's going into one of these worlds, right? Cool. So let's talk about information aggregation for decisions. So let's say now we go back to our original question, right, which is if we should fund Tally, and we ask the question in a slightly different way. We say, what's the outcome we want? It's not that we end up in a world. Let's say we split the world into we fund Tally or we don't fund Tally, and then we go into those worlds and we say, what if we fund Tally and we get the outcome we want, or we fund Tally and we don't get the outcome we want? Similarly, what if we don't fund Tally and we get the outcome we want, or we don't fund Tally and we don't get the outcome we want? And so you can craft a question or a contract that pays out only if you fund Tally and you get the outcome you want, right? Does this make sense? Right? So the $1 is only going to be $1 in the world where those two things have happened, right? And there's all these other branching worlds that could exist, right? And so this now gives you the probability that the thing you want happens. And that's the only time when you should actually issue the funds, right? If we're trying to make a good decision here, that's the reason why we would make the decision. We want to fund things that produce the outcomes we want. Is everyone following me? Anyone disagree? All right. so this is an interesting structure because we can now start to ladder this up into what we call conditional funding markets. So this contract on the top will pay $1 if funding tally will increase voter retention by 20%, assuming that's what we care about, like voter retention gets increased. And then on the bottom, we'll pay out $1 if funding tally increases voter retention by less than 20%. So really, we're saying we only really want to fund tally if it's going to produce this thing, which is like growing voter retention by over 20%. And so the markets will price the top one. So they say like 70% of the time we end up in that world, and 30% of the time we end up in this other world. And a good way of thinking about this is like, let's say there are 10 versions of the future. 7 of those worlds, tally does this, right? It works out. And in like 3 of those worlds, it doesn't. It just doesn't actually produce the outcome we want. Right? And so you kind of say it's probably quite probable that we do end up in this good world, so we should fund tally, right? Okay, I'm going to keep like hammering this because I think it's like once people understand it, it becomes quite simple to like reason about prediction markets and conditional markets and also Futarchy. So yeah, so we select this. So again, what we're doing now is we're taking those probabilities and we're using them to produce a decision, right? We're not waiting for some outside event to happen and then resolving the markets. We're going to make the decision, and then once we've made the decision, we're in that world, right? We've selected it. And now we're hoping that the actual event occurs. And if the event occurs, anybody who holds that contract, what happens to them? They get $1. Okay? This contract will resolve to $1. This is a conditional funding market. This is basically what we're working on. We're in the process of building the application. I'll show you a screenshot in a second. Might be the next slide. It's the next slide. This is us using it for a hiring market. So imagine you wanted to hire someone. You could actually say, what's the outcome that we want, which is, for example, we're trying to hire someone to do some writing for us. So we could run a market where we say, what would be the number of, let's say we wanted to measure engagement. What would be the number of replies that person might get to their article, right? And then we could actually run a prediction market to see who gets the most replies and use that as a method by which we distribute funds. Okay, so this is a conditional funding market. So if I was going to ask any one of you to go out of this room and then try and explain Futarchy to someone else, I would say the best way of describing it is if markets believe that an outcome, and this notation is just this bar is like conditional on, so an outcome conditional on us making decision A. So if we pick that we're going to go into this world, we make that decision, that world is more valuable than the outcome given we make the other decision, right? Decision B, right? Which might be decision A is do the thing, decision B is not do the thing. And if the first one is more valuable than the second, choose decision A. Simple? Confusing? Anyone confused? Confused enough. All right. Maybe comprehension has gone up a little bit. Okay, good. Okay. So I'm going to again change speed. So now we're going to talk about the kind of theory or vision of governance. And what I'm going to do is kind of go back to the theory of a firm. We have DAOs today, right? We have governance, we're governing DAOs. And that's kind of become the kind of zeitgeist of governance. We have these DAOs, we have to govern them, we have to make decisions. And when you ask yourself, what is a DAO? Why do we have an organization? You have to go back to why do we have actual organizations already? And if you go back to, someone actually decided to ask this question, why do firms exist? Why don't we just have free markets of people running around, doing transactions, entering into their own contracts, doing their own marketing? Why don't we just have a nation of freelancers? And so someone tried to answer. His name is Ronald Coase. This was in 1937. He published a essay paper called The Nature of the Firm. It should have been called The Theory of the Firm, but it's The Nature of the Firm. And he asked the question, why do firms exist? And his conclusion was transaction costs. And a good way of thinking about transaction costs is there any costs associated with time, triangulation, we have to triangulate different things like people to work with and different things to do and different ideas, triangulation, and then trust, right? This is kind of the components of transaction costs. And so theoretically, if you're a human being, which I assume all of you are, you have two options, and you have more than these, but let's just make it simple. You can sell your labor to the market directly, you'd be a freelancer, or you can sell your labor to a firm, to an organization who are organizing your labor. And the reason why you might do that is because you're trying to, again, you're self-interested, you're dangerously long try and maximize your return, right? So why you would only really sell your labor to a firm if the cost, the transaction costs of being directly in the market is too great. And the other way, and obviously the other thing is true, right? The reverse is true. So in markets, imagine every single person running their own supply chain. That means they're going and sourcing all of the things, the raw ingredients that they can pull together in order to actually produce a product or a service that people want to buy. Imagine them doing their own marketing and enforcing their own contracts. You can see like most of the there are lots of freelancers, but they're normally in industries where they can do this quite easily, right? They can find all their supplies, maybe because all their supplies are digital, right? So there's lots of digital designers and digital developers. Freelance designers and freelance developers. So if you had this world, you basically end up you're doing this because there are such like lower transaction costs for you to do this directly that you don't necessarily need a firm to organize the labor. But some things like producing burgers globally, you really need someone to come in and do the job of like collapsing down those transaction costs by like entering also into all the ingredients to secure all the beef globally. So you don't have to do this yourself. And then they have all the contracts around them, and then you just have to go and work for them. And then you can be involved in the production of burgers. And because I think this is quite weird to like understand or think about, I also did these stupid diagrams. So when transaction costs are low, you just get all your contracts yourself. When transaction costs are really high, you just go and let someone else do that work. And then you get to like, they kind of amortize the cost over like all the people who come and work for them. Okay? So you have to ask yourself, if the nature of the firms are just firms exist because they centralize and lower transaction costs, why do DAOs exist? No, it's a question to you. Does anyone know? No answers? Regulatory arbitrage. Why are we here, guys? We don't know why DAOs exist. We're all here because DAOs exist. Okay. I don't know. I think I'm trying to find out the answer to this question, right? Why do they exist? So I was like looking through the like annals of crypto, and I was trying to find like, why did people come up with this idea? There is like a lot of information on some of these ideas from Nick Szabo, which I definitely recommend reading on his blog, or I think it's not even on the blog, I think it's on the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute website now, and the podcast. Oh, Szabo? I've actually never seen it. I would recommend checking that out if you're into Rogan. And then there's also some really interesting blog posts from Dan Larimer and Stan Larimer on the DAC, Decentralized Autonomous Corporation, which technically predates like the first time that Ethereum spoke about DAOs. Again, really, really great. Would recommend reading that. But one of the things that Vitalik quotes is he said he read this book, and this is really what gave him the idea for DAOs. And the thing that's interesting about this book, if you read it, and I definitely recommend reading it, is that it's like the idea of a distributed program, a set of rules, and it defines, I don't want to give away too much, but it kind of defines this entire new world order. It's incredible, and I would definitely recommend reading it. But the new world order is based on meritocracy and decentralized control. One of the things that this daemon is not, is it's not an organization. The daemon functions as a distributed intelligence. It uses the intelligence of the people in the network. It kind of like finds a way to capitalize that, which helps. They have this like peer-to-peer like reward-based system. They're ranking each other and so on. It's really interesting. It kind of runs like a game. It's actually a game AI that breaks out. That's kind of the idea. It kind of guides humans towards like these better collective outcomes, which is really, really cool. I think it's really worth reading. It's really fun. But the insight is a daemon is not an organization. That's the important takeaway. So why do we have organizations? Well, I think it's mostly based on this. Like DAOs, really, the development is based on like us trying to avoid some of the things listed in this document, right? So this is based on the Howey test, which is the securities test, right? The test by how they'll figure out that an asset is actually an investment contract. And I think lots of DAOs are really just trying to make sure that they don't look like they're issuing assets, right? The people who run the organization are issuing the assets, so they distribute the control to a bunch of people, and it helps them avoid this reasonable expectation of profits derived from efforts of others, because you're not expecting there to be efforts of others if you're actually the person making the decision. Hence, organizations. So we call this a DAO, token voter assembly. Lots of people get together, they have ideas, they have tokens, they vote. I would like to suggest that we should start thinking about DAOs as this, the collection of organizations and people and entities that orbit something. They orbit a protocol, they orbit like some collective like goal or something like that. And I think that could be a really refreshing way of thinking about what DAOs should be, though maybe we don't want to call them DAOs. Hint, I'm gonna try and come up with a new name. But I do think this much better reflects what I think DAOs are. Like lots of people who are in the DAO part of Uniswap are confused about Unichain. They say, why didn't we know about Unichain? Why weren't we involved in Unichain? And it's like, well, you didn't know, but the DAO knew, right? Labs knew, right? Because they worked on it. And I think it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have all of these things in one entity. They can be distributed. And another really interesting part is if you think about like labs, foundation, and kind of the token voters, labs is kind of like the developers, right? The avatar of the developers. The foundation is kind of like the avatar, like the representation of like the protocol's users, right? And then you have the token assembly as well, which kind of represents the users as well. And it's kind of maps to like Bitcoin, where Bitcoin has like the developers, that team of developers who kind of have some governance power, then the actual like users who hold Bitcoin who have some governance power, and then obviously the miners who have some governance power. And so I think that I think a good model for DAOs is that, right? It's like looking at Bitcoin. And actually it's just a collection of those things called Bitcoin. There's no one entity you point at and say that's Bitcoin. So potentially we could start thinking about DAOs as instead of being this like token holder or token voter assembly, we can think about them as being these like multilateral treaties between these organizations. A contract that just helps to enforce the rules by which all of these organizations interact, right? The nexus of contracts for that org. A hyperstructure. I don't like that term, but a hyperstructure. Yeah. It's not a Jacob term. Oh, okay, it's not. I thought you meant the Jacob hyperstructure. Okay. Okay, all right, maybe I should go and check out the real meaning of hyperstructure. But yeah, so this idea of instead of being DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, decentralized autonomous money printers, though someone did point out that the acronym is DAMP, which is horrible, so we're not going to say DAMP, but we're also not going to say distributed resource allocation mechanisms, DRAM. They're both quite strange, so I think I prefer DRAM. So the idea is just a system, a contract that itself coordinates the actions of people and corporations and entities and service providers and all of that group, and it kind of like guides them towards better group outcomes. So I know I'm way over on time, so I'm gonna try and speed up. Actually, I'm not doing too bad. Another way of thinking about this, which maybe is quite relevant now, is this idea of like industrial policy. So how can we change the way that we allocate our funding to create better outcomes for us as a collective, all right? Especially if they're a collective of different entities doing different things. What could we do at the top level so that it kind of guides the actions of everyone at the bottom level without having to have explicit arrangements between those organizations? So you could argue that a token does this already, right? Just the token existing kind of does this, but yeah, you kind of see this already. This is what nations do, right? So I think this like tracks with where we're kind of developing these DAOs. And the kind of CHIPS Act, for anyone who's not like super familiar with American trade policy, which could be loads of people, CHIPS Act, for example, is just a bunch of subsidies for anybody building chips inside the US, right? So you could say, like, similarly in like the Ethereum ecosystem, we want to have like a bunch of money for people who are doing X. And actually we kind of already have this, and I'll kind of explain why in the future. So the word we're going to coin, and maybe this is like a working title, so give me some feedback on this, is autonomous. So you may still have DAOs, the kind of meme of DAOs is fairly set, but we might want to have this thing that sits above it. We're calling that autonomous. So kind of taking the A out of DAOs and just saying like, what if we just target that? And so an autonomous is one of these like conditional funding markets. It's just this, it has some metrics, it has some goals. Maybe it has a basket of metrics, maybe there's multiple of them, and they're just distributing capital based on these metrics, right? It's actually, if you think about it, it's kind of what retro public goods funding is trying to do. And it's capture resistant, right? It's markets who run these things. It's autonomous, it's transparent, and it's rule-based, right? Like a rule-based order, which we quite like. And you could imagine this being the system that's distributing funding to the labs organization. It's distributing funding to the foundation. It's distributing funding to the token holders, to the users. Like it's a way of distributing capital where it needs to in order to kind of like keep the organization intact. And the great thing about these things is they're just pieces of software. They're just contracts. They could be composed. They could be like mapped to each other. And so you could end up with this structure that looks like protocol autonomy, which sit at protocols and they distribute funding directly to the labs organization, the foundations. Then you could have these supra like buckets of capital that distribute funds across ecosystems, across protocols. And then you could have this kind of like super versions of autonomy, which are like right at the top end, and they're just ecosystems. They just distribute funds to ecosystems. And when I did this, I mean, it's pretty messy, but when I did this, I realized that we kind of have achieved this with the like L2 roadmap, because if you think about the ecosystem autonomy, you could kind of say that's the EF like grants, right? And then if you come down, you can say that super autonomy is kind of like maybe Gitcoin grants, right? Or you could say that this is like L2s, right? L2 grants, like retro funding. And then that comes down into protocols and they distribute further funding. So again, this is what we believe is like a really exciting vision for what like DAOs could be if we just take the autonomous part out and we start doing that properly. And we can add all the other stuff in later. So for me, this is a bet on distributed intelligence, right? embedding the intelligence in the network. And what I did have here was instead of saying this is a bet on distributed intelligence, I just said the implication is that we just beat Solana. And what I'm saying here is that we already have a system with lots of distributed intelligence. We just don't have the mechanisms to harness it. If we can get those mechanisms correct, we can have this distributed intelligence with lots of these like autonomous like groups who are all working in the same direction without having to centralize control. And this is a bet on distributed intelligence over centralized intelligence, AKA Solana. And so this is a great example of the Protocol Guild. Who's familiar with Protocol Guild? Really great system. It's a list of people, right? These people are doing really important work, technically offering a public good to Ethereum by working on the Ethereum protocols or the Ethereum protocol itself. And this just distributes money to them. Money goes in, distributes the money to these people on the list. It's really simple, but it works really well. There's some rules by how you end up on this list, which are considered like fairly capture resistant or credibly neutral. And it manages to attract and retain some of the best talent in Ethereum. And so we could have loads of these conditional funding markets, distributing capital under certain conditions that we all agree are in our collective benefit. So if Uniswap fund Tally, will this create more value for the Uniswap ecosystem? That's the question we should ask ourselves when we distribute capital from any of these protocols, right? If it was an autonomo running it, this is the question the autonomo would be asking. But also, we should ask if Uniswap fund Tally, will this create more value for the Ethereum ecosystem, right? Because if it does, then we should be distributing more capital. And that's basically where I'd like to end. Conditional funding markets could become like one of the most important innovations if we get the capital right and if we get the metrics right. There's a big if, and I think we still need to do some work on that. But yeah, this is conditional funding markets. So yeah, if it works out, being long me is being the same as being long the protocol, and absolutely being the same as being long the entire ecosystem. Oh, and also there's, I keep saying this is the end. This is the end. This is an example of that same question, but as a conditional funding market. And that's it. Thank you for listening to me talk about conditional funding markets. We're really excited about them, obviously. And if you're interested in learning more, please come and ask. We're actually going to be rolling these out in the next couple of months with, again, 2 protocols. One, we can't announce this yet, but the other one is Uniswap. And yeah, we should have these conditional funding markets out soon. And I hope you will jump in and participate. Thank you.